Hey there, my name is Jordan Leroy Hansen, also known as LevDev, and I'm here to provide a card-by-card review of the upcoming Magic the Gathering expansion, the new Core Set 2019. Now, for those who are either new to Magic or don't know what a Core Set is, a Core Set is essentially an introductory level to the game of Magic. For people who are new to the game, this set is usually a good introductory set. It allows people to test out essentially low-powered mechanics or pretty easy archetypes to allow them to understand some of the more basic evergreen mechanics that are in Magic, such as flying, deft touch, etc., etc. And even sometimes they slip in a few powerful cards for experienced players to try out and just have fun with. So for now, I'm going to review these cards all in a grading system as you see below. Now I'm going to look at cards for each of the formats: Draft, Limited Sealed, Commander, Standard, Modern, Commander, and even Brawl. And the ratings go from this. Playable. Playable means that it will probably see play. Like, the card is either really good, or it fits into an existing archetype, or just in itself it's just a tempting card to play. Maybe is my little rating that says I don't know whether or not the card will see play or not. More experienced players in the specific formats might have a better understanding and might actually give a better insight on whether or not the card is playable in that specific format. Which, if you have any specific sources you go to, I would recommend that if you don't see a decisive opinion on specific cards. Janky is kind of the card is probably going to see some fringe play in some silly decks. For me, I like the Jank Brew a lot, and there's some cards in the set that just tempts I'm going to make a really janky brew out of it. But usually this rating means that the card, while we'll see some fringe play, it doesn't mean it's going to be very competitively viable if you're that type of player. And then there's a rating of no, which is my way of saying, with these specific applications of some specific formats, the card is probably not going to see play beyond those formats. With that in mind, we're going to start our review with the gold cards in this set, starting off with the Elliott Engineer, a 4-mana 2/4, 2 attack, 4 toughness, costing 2 generic in blue and a white. It's a creature human artificer, and has the ability that as long as you control an artifact, Elliott Engineer gets +2/+0 and has flying. Now, one thing to keep in mind when we go into these gold cards, there's a variety of different type of gold cards. Some of them are relatively big bombs of the set that they want to feature as highlight cards, and then there's some cards that are known as signpost cards from the design team. What a signpost card is it's a card that helps players who are either drafting the set or playing sealed to encourage them, if they're still new to the mechanics and such, to encourage them to build into certain archetypes that the designers intend for the set. So, obviously, Elliott Engineer is a signpost card, and the drafting archetype that they want you to encourage to go into in Limited is blue-white artifacts. Once we get to the blue and white cards of the set, you'll see that there's a lot of cards that encourage artifact synergies, or creating artifacts, or protecting artifacts. And this card is actually a pretty decent bomb for that draft archetype. I mean, having a 4-mana 4/4 flyer as long as you control an artifact, that is really good. So in draft and sealed, as long as you have the appropriate amount of artifacts, note, good artifacts. I would not recommend playing bad artifacts to encourage the synergy. A 4-mana 4/4 flyer is tempting, but it's not tempting to make your deck less consistent with bad artifacts. And there are some bad artifacts in this set once we get to them. But in Draft and Sealed, as long as you get to that archetype, it's playable. A 4-mana 4/4 flyer is great. In Commander, there are some Esper / also Jeskai artifact style decks that might think about using this card as a 37th card. However, there's a lot of better artifact synergy cards within the history of Magic that people might prefer to use over this. Some might do it if it's like their favorite card and they remember it and such, so I'm going to say this is a maybe in Commander, but it's not one of the more powerful artifact synergy cards that you see in the history of Magic, so that's a maybe. Brawl, if people are still playing with artifact brawl decks, this is not a bad bomb to get to, especially with the proper commander. I mean, heck, if a Dolvin Ball artifact... Dolvin Ball... I cannot pronounce that Planeswalker's name worth my life. If a Dolvin artifact control style deck works, they might consider this as a bomb in the deck. I would not recommend it, but in Brawl it's a possibility. Standard, I would also say maybe 2 on this one. Because there is the temptation that there is some blue-white God Pharaoh Gift style decks that might actually be tempted to put this card in there. Now don't get me wrong, there are better bombs in the format that are actually better to quote-unquote regenerate out of the graveyard using God Pharaoh's Gift. But a 6-mana 6/4 flyer with haste from God Pharaoh's Gift, because the factor that since God Pharaoh's Gift is an artifact, that is actually pretty tempting. So that's why I'm going to say maybe. In the Eternal formats like Modern, Legacy, and Vintage, I'm going to go out on a limb and say no. There are just better artifact synergy cards within that format that are faster, that they don't really want a 4-mana, maybe it's a flyer, maybe it's not card. I'm just going to say utterly no. But still, this is going to be a fun card in Draft and Sealed, and I think some people are going to just have some fun fringe play in some of the more casual formats. Anyway, on to the next card. It's the Poison Tip Archer. This is a 4-mana card as well. It's a 2/3, 2 black and green for a creature elf archer at uncommon. This has the ability of Reach, which for those who are new to the game means that it can block creatures with flying, as mentioned in the little help text there. And also Death Touch, which means that if it deals any combat damage during combat, it can destroy the creature that it's dealing the combat damage to. And it also has a nifty ability that whenever another creature dies, each opponent loses 1 life. So, in Draft, this is yet again another signpost card. They're essentially encouraging players here to go into a black-green, probably mid-range if I have to make a guess. The fact that we have enough good black removal spells, or even black mid-range creatures, and even green mid-range creatures to help control the board state, to help take advantage of the whenever another creature dies, each opponent loses 1 life. This is obviously what they're kind of encouraging. So for Draft and Sealed, if you can get into that archetype and have good cards, I would say give it a shot. This card is really powerful. While people really prefer low-cost Death Touch creatures, the factor that this has Reach as well is actually really powerful, especially since most of the late game bombs in this set are flyers. The factor that you can have this consistent threat to make them not be very cautious when flying in with their bomb, that's really good. The only catch to it is with the free toughness, so it can die to a majority of the removal in the format, besides shock. But still, this is well worth the cost to help protect yourself against some of the late flying bombs in this set. Now, for Commander, I think this is playable. This is a card that in the Gagari style decks that are very aristocratic in nature, or very controlling mid-range, they actually might consider this card. Also, it's an elf, which I don't know if it's 100% significant, but it's definitely tempting, especially in decks that are using cards that help synergize with elves to help either gain or lose life, so that's something to consider. And yet again, it protects against most flying bombs in the Commander meta, so I'd say this will see playable in Commander, no sweat. Standard, I'm going to say maybe. Well, it could be playable. And the reason is that, really, this is a card that's very useful in mid-range decks. And the catch-22 of it is, in the current meta, mid-range decks, with the exception of some token-based synergy decks, are not that very popular. It's either you're playing a very heavy aggro-based deck, or you're playing a heavy control-based deck. And this card dies to those archetypes relatively easy. However, though, it is still tempting to have a 2-free Death Toucher with flying to help protect against flying bombs, if it weren't for the fact that Glory Bringer is in the meta and can actually kill this before you can even block with it. Yeah, this is a maybe for me. I want to see play in Standard, so it might get my janky rating, because it is just one of those creatures that are very versatile for what it costs. But it's definitely going to be a maybe or janky. Now, in Eternal formats like Modern, Legacy, and Vintage, I'm going to go all out and say no. There's just so many powerful cards within the 4 mana slot that it's very competitive, and there are some that are legitimately better than a Poison Tip Archer. There's some that might, and I'll go give this a slight edge on being janky also, because there might be some people who are either in Sultai or Gregarii colors that might just consider this as just an additional elf in their elf decks to help them for sideboard against spirit decks or specific flying decks. And that's a maybe, but I'm really leaning on no, it's probably not going to see play in those formats. But still, this is going to be a great draft card, and I could see some people having fun with this in Commander, and maybe even Standard. Maybe in Standard. Anyway, next card is still one of the creepiest arts that they provided in this set. Ugh, that art creeps me out. But it is the 6 mana cost for generic, black and blue, Psychic Symbiote. It is a creature nightmare horror. It's a 3/3, flying, and whenever a Psychic Symbiote enters the battlefield, target opponent discards a card, and you draw a card. Now, this is another signpost card in the set, and obviously this card is mostly used for encouraging blue-black control, which for any of those who are new to Magic, blue-black control essentially amounts to either a heavy control-based counter/discard synergies, or even removal-based / that. Your main point is you're controlling until you get to the late game for specific high-value bombs. So is this enough high-value bomb for a control deck? In Draft Unlimited? I'm going to say it's a midway between playable and maybe. On one hand, a free flyer that makes an opponent discard a card, and you draw a card, in Sealed, is really good. Draft, I don't know. That's where I'm going to go maybe on it, because, true, you might have the ability in Draft to make a more consistent blue-black control deck. However, blue-black control is still something I'm kind of on the fence about as an archetype in this format. There are definitely cards to encourage it. There are definitely cards that will make people try to veal into it, but I don't think it's going to be as powerful as the other archetypes. Still, if you do get enough control-based cards or cards to help you keep a consistent control over the game, this is not a bad late game. Now, in Commander, I'm going to go out and say no. This card is pretty much a Dimir. It's a lesser version of really, really good Dimir control cards that are currently in the Commander meta. So, I'm going to say some janky players might play with this just as their 37th card. But in Commander with cards that are in the Dimir, there's just a ton, and I mean a ton, of better options. Though, if someone plays blue-black or even a variation of those colors in Brawl, I'm going to say this is playable. With a caution that if you have a better card for your Brawl deck, you might take this out as the 37th card. Just saying. Now, in Standard, I'm also going to say no again, because currently the control decks in the meta are relatively powerful enough and are competing against with some mini late game bombs, including some we're going to see later in this review for the gold cards, that a 6 mana free flyer just doesn't really cut it. So, and then in Modern, Legacy, and Vintage, I'm also going to say no again, because the control deck archetypes currently in those formats do not need a 6 mana free flyer that draws a card, that lets you draw a card and lets the opponent discard a card. It just, no. No. So I think this is a card that's going to be stuck into the limited formats with maybe some janky play once in a while in a Brawl deck, but I would not recommend playing this in Standard or any of the Eternal formats. But that's just my opinion. Anyway, on to the next card. It's the Draconic Disciple, a free mana, 1 generic, and red and green for a 2/2 creature human shaman. It has 2 activated abilities. One of them is add 1 mana of any color. So it's a more expensive Birds of Paradise. For those who don't know what Birds of Paradise is, it's a 1 mana 1/1 that is a bird that can do this ability as well. But it also has a mana sink of 7 mana and tap to sacrifice it and create a 5/5 red dragon creature token with flying. Now, this is another, yet again, signpost card. And this one is encouraging players who go into the red-green to go into a ramp late game deck. Like, you want to ramp. You want to try to get your creatures out really fast, and they're supposed to be big. They're supposed to be dragons. There's also some powerful late game creatures that are not dragons, but mostly this one in flavor is promoting to you to try to ramp into dragons and such. But still, there is some also powerful late game creatures once we get into red and green that you will not mind using Draconic Disciple to ramp into. Trust me on that one. Now, in Draft and Sealed, is this playable? Yes. And I mean that. This is yes. Mana Dorks in Limited is nothing to sneeze about. Especially a Mana Dork that can generate mana of any color. Now, one hint I'm going to give about for Sealed and Limited, while it is going to be mostly a 2-color format, there are some bombs that are currently in the draft or limited meta of this set that you might not mind trying to splash a third color. Now, only for like 1 or 2 cards that are very powerful bombs. Don't go all 3 colors, just make sure it's 2 colors with a splash of the third. And there is still at least a decent amount of fixing that it can encourage you to go into that. And Draconic Disciple is one of those cards. The factor that it's a Birds of Paradise, it helps you ramp into your late game dragons or late game big creatures, but can also help you splash again for a third color bomb or something, which is really good. And also that mana sink ability, so once you get enough lands on the battlefield, you can just put 7 mana in, make a 5/5 red dragon creature with flying, and help finish the game off. That's really good. And hopefully the format, at least in Limited, is slow enough that this is actually a significant mana sink. Commander, I'm going to go with ranging from playable to maybe. It's one of those cards where I think it's very flavorful in the Dragon decks, and it's a nice mana rock with the mana sink ability. However, with how competitive Mana Dorks and also Mana Rocks in general are in Commander formats, I think this is one of those where if people do play it, it's mostly going to be for flavor alone. I mean, for Pete's sakes, once we get to artifacts, there's actually a better Mana Rock that helps synergize very well with Dragon decks beside this one. However, also Brawl is something to consider, and I think it's going to be very playable in Brawl. That's just a really good Mana Dork. A Mana Dork that can help you generate any color in that format with some specific Brawl deck commanders is nothing to sneeze at. Now, in Standard, this one I'm going to go with maybe. The thing is, on the surge of Llanowar Elves coming back into Standard, most people are relishing the factor that they can play 1 turn, first mana, just first turn, 1 mana Mana Dorks again. So Draconic Disciple doesn't seem as exciting. However, like I said, the factor that it's a Mana Dork of any color is still something to consider in some deck archetypes that might need the ramp options, even though it is prone to a lot of removal in that format. So I'm going to say maybe to janky. That's probably the best thing it's going to see in Standard. Though, if a Dragon deck is possible in Standard, they might actually want to use this card. Now, for extended formats, the Eternal formats like Modern, Legacy, and Vintage, I'm just going to go out and say no. And the main reason why I'm saying no to that is just the simple fact that those formats have a lot of efficient mana dorks. And even with the banning of Deathrite Shaman, they still have enough mana dorks that are at lower costs that they would prefer over this card. Now, if someone's starting out with a budget deck, maybe they'll try this out, but I'm going to say no. You probably do not want to play it in Modern, you probably don't want to play it in Vintage or Legacy. But still, this is going to be a fun... I think this card is going to see its shining in Brawl, though, because this is a really good Brawl card. And also in Limited, for obvious reasons that I mentioned before. Anyway, the next card we're going to get to is Your Reprint. Anyone who played during the Amonkhet block might actually have a memory of this card. It's the 3 mana, 1 generic blue-red Enigma Drake. It is a star 4 flying Drake, that's its creature type, and its power is equal to the number of instant and sorcery cards in your graveyard. Now, obviously, this is another, yet again, signpost card, and this one is encouraging a blue-red spells deck. So for those of you who are not familiar with the archetype, blue-red spells essentially is a deck that basically amounts to wanting a bunch of instant and sorcery spells, and kind of go either into a storm route with it, or be a very combo/control-oriented tempo deck to essentially help get in for cheap damage. An Enigma Drake in Draft is amazing if you can get into the blue-red spells deck. Just the factor that it's a flyer that gets power increased better and better and better once you cast more instant sorcery spells, which if you are in that deck archetype you're going to cast, this card's just really great at Limited. In Commander, I mean, there's some Izzet builds that do run this card because the factor that it is a second version of Chimera. I always forget the name of the card. It's the one with the goat art on it that's from Pharaoh's block. But still, there's some Izzet decks that play this because if they are kind of like a Storm variation build where they cast a ton of spells, this creature gets big really quick in Commander. Also, in Brawl, if you're playing an Izzet style deck, I could see play it there, so it's playable there. Standard, yeah, it's playable. We have seen a ton of Enigma Drake style decks that essentially is kind of like what we mentioned with the Draft archetype. You cast a ton of spells, you cycle, you make this big, and you try to swing in for lethal damage with the Drake. This is a popular archetype on MTG Arena. It's a popular janky/casual standard archetype in Standard. Yeah, as long as they're the cards from the Amonkhet block to help support it yet with Drake, it's going to see play in Standard. Now, the Eternal formats like Modern, Legacy, and Vintage, this one I'm going to say maybe because I legitimately don't know if it sees play in those formats. People who are knowledgeable about that format might correct me on this, but I do feel like for Storm-style decks, they want better payoffs than Enigma Drake. But that's my opinion, so I'm going to say maybe on that. But still, Enigma Drake is still a highly playable card in a multiple formats. And you're going to just have fun playing it if you go into blue-red spells. It's amazing. Okay, on to the next card, which is the Satire Enchanter. Probably one of the worst signpost cards from this set, in my personal opinion. It's a 3 mana, 1 generic, green and white, Satire Druid creature, 2/2, so it's a bear. It is whenever you cast an enchantment spell, draw a card. Guys, in Limited, like Draft and Sealed, obviously the signpost they're trying to encourage here is a green-white's enchantments deck. And while there are some green and white enchantments that I would not mind playing, there's also some that I think are generically bad and I would not recommend people playing in the Limited format. And the factor that the payoff to try to play even potentially those bad cards is just a bear that might help you draw a card. Guys, I mean, I would say this is a 23rd card in a Limited deck. Like, If you turn out to be a green-white deck that has a few enchantments, and you need a bear, and you don't have any other playables, go and try it out. You'll probably have some decent fun with it. But in Limited, I'm going to range it from being janky to no. Now in Commander and Brawl, completely different story. The factor that you can actually stack the enchantments and actually draw a ton of cards with this in the Commander and Brawl format with specific deck archetypes, plus there being some powerful enchantments within those formats, I would say it is totally playable in those formats. You'll probably have fun with this as your 37th card, and if you can get a few card draws out of it, or even enchant it itself, splendid. Now in Standard, this is a maybe. This is a legitimate maybe. It's because the main reason is that green-white's enchantments, there is a green-white mid-range deck that's very popular that runs some enchantments, but I don't think their free drop slot would allow them to put this card within their deck archetype. It's a free mana 2/2. It's even with that ability for you to draw a card, I'm not sure green-white enchantments are currently viable in the Standard format. I do think I'll put it under janky though, because it is something I do kind of want to brew around, making a green-white kind of like Danafa or enchantment control deck. And this card might actually fit right in without a sweat. Now, in the Eternal formats like Modern, Legacy, Vintage, I'm just going to go out on a limb and say no. Like I said before, while green-white enchantments and Boggle-style decks are a fiend in those formats, there's a lot more efficient creatures that are very competitive against this card, and people would play over this card. I mean, there's a lot. So I'm going to say no. Sorry, little guy. You are nice. It's nice to have a druid in Magic. But I think you are going to see some very fringe play. In my professional opinion. Okay, on to the next card. This is another signpost card, and it's the Regal Bloodlord. A free mana, black and white, so 5 costing, creature, vampire soldier. It's a 2/4 flyer. And then at the beginning of each instep, if you gain life this turn, create a 1/1 black bat creature token with flying. That's a bit of a word jibble. So, the black-white deck that they're trying to encourage with this signpost card is a life gain deck. And is that a deck archetype currently in this limited format? Seeing the black and white cards currently, I would say yes. There's a lot of life gain in this set. There is just some very powerful life gain cards. And I think this is a pretty good bomb if you can get into that archetype. I mean, it's a 2/4 flyer, which is nothing to sneeze at, and it's not that fancy. But the factor that if you can get consistent life gain and create a bunch of black creature tokens with flying, that's just some really good chump blockers. And even then, you could also, if you don't need to chump block them, you could just swing in and help get you closer to winning the game. So in limited formats like Draft and Sealed, I say if you're in the life gain deck, this is a playable card. No sweat about that. Now in Commander, I would say, yes, this is a playable card. As people who are probably playing the format know, vampires is a thing. And there are some vampire decks in Commander that are very aristocratic in nature. Like they want to focus on life gain. And this is not a horrible bomb for that deck. Like, it's not like a big bomb compared to the other vampires that are in the history of Magic. But still, this is not bad. I mean, the factor that it encourages you to create more bat tokens, which you can use for aristocrat-style synergies. I say this is a playable card in that format. And in Brawl decks, yeah, they're going to play this. Black-White Vampire Brawl is a thing, and this is a playable card in those decks. So, no sweat about that. Now, Standard, I'm going to go on the fringe and say maybe. The factor is, when we get to higher cost creatures like this that are very slow, and this is a slow card, like the factor you do get a lot of token generation is nice, but it's very slow. Like you gain a life each turn, that's when you generate the token. And the format is relatively fast-paced enough that I do think a 5-mana 2/4 might not cut it. It might be tempting for people to try in janky vampire decks, since Vampire Tribal is still a thing in Standard, so people might still give it a shot, but I think it's definitely a maybe to either just jank. Now, in Eternal formats like Modern, Legacy, and Vintage, I'm just going to go out and say no. It's too high cost for how fast-paced the format is, and even though it's a cool vampire with some cool mechanical synergies with life gain, it's just too slow. Will just get easily removed before you can take advantage of the life gain generation tokens and such. So, overall, you'll play this in Draft, you'll play this in Standard maybe, but Commander and Brawl, this card is going to see a lot of play. Just count me on that one. Anyway, the next card we're going to go to is the Signpost for Rectus, or Red-Black, which in this case is the Brawl Bash Ogre. It's a 2 generic mana, Red-Black, creature, Ogre Warrior. It's a 3/3. It has Menace, which means it can't be blocked except by 2 or more creatures. And it has, whenever it attacks, you may sacrifice another creature. If you do, Brawl Bash Ogre gets +2/+2 until end of turn. So, obviously this is a signpost for a Rakdos Red-Black kind of sacrifice deck. You generate probably tokens, or you generate creatures that can regenerate themselves, and you sack them to get marginal benefits, such as with Brawl Bash Ogre. So, will this encourage enough for people to play in Draft? I would say, yeah, it's playable. It's a potentially 5/5 with Menace, and this Red-Black sacrifice deck is actually seeming a lot more viable. Especially the fact that there's stuff like Active Trees and such, so you can actually sack opponents' creatures, which is freaking hilarious. So yeah, I'm going to say that it's very playable in this format. Now, in Commander and Brawl, I'm going to go with saying a maybe. While there are decks that definitely do love the strategy of stealing opponents' stuff to sacrifice for stuff, in Commander at the very least, there's a lot better sack outlets and such, or cards that you can sack to get significant benefits, Ashnod's Altar, etc., etc. Though, this is not a bad 37 card for the Commander decks that will rely on that specific synergy. Because a 5/5 with Menace is nothing to complain about. Brawl, if there are that type of decks that do play that type of synergy of kind of like sack outlets and such, it's not a bad 23rd to... I'm saying it's just a janky inclusion in a Brawl deck. Now in Standard, I'm going to go out and say no. It's just one of those cards where it is just... it can die to a lot of fiends in the format, and currently the 4-drop slot in Standard is very competitive. And this card does not cut it. Now, in Eternal formats like Modern, Legacy, and Vintage, yet again, I'm going to say no. 4-mana slot, very competitive, and this card just doesn't cut it. So, conclusion, you'll play this in Draft. You'll probably play this as a janky card for your Commander or your Brawl deck, but I would not recommend trying it in the other formats. But anyway, let's get on to now the next card, which is Heroic Enforcements, or Heroic Reinforcements, which is a 4-mana, 2 generic, red-black sorcery spell, which is create 2 white soldier creature tokens. Until end of turn, creatures you control get +1/+1 and gain haste. Now, obviously for this one, for red and white, it is what's called Boros. And usually Boros strategy signposting cards usually want to encourage go wide decks. You'll want to generate a bunch of creatures, either generate a ton of tokens and such. Go wide and try to attack with lethal with a bunch of weenies. And obviously this card encourages that archetype without a sweat. The fact that you can create tokens that will become 2/2s when they attack, and they're going to attack on the turn that they come in, which then essentially just makes this sorcery a 4-mana 4/4 with haste, that's just really good in Draft. If you're in the archetype that goes wide and you're going to get a wide board and get a significant buff of getting all your creatures +1/+1, that can be a finisher, guys. So I'm going to say this is a playable card in Draft and Sealed. In Commander, well, it's kind of one of those, if you play a Boros Go Wide deck in Commander or Brawl, you're probably going to play this card. It's a nice Trumpet Blast. It's not as good as a Trumpet Blast, mind you, but the factor that you do generate the tokens, which there are ways to create twice tokens with annoyed processions and such, I do think those cards will see play in Commander and will see play in Brawl without a sweat. Standard, that one is, I'm going to go on maybe. And the reason why I'm going maybe on that is while there are token decks currently in Standard, really we have token decks that are more focusing on getting taller tokens rather than going wide with the tokens. Due to the factor that Goblin Chain Whirl is in the meta, and if you try to go wide with a bunch of weenies, chances are they're going to die to a Chain Whirl and you're going to feel bad. So I think it's going to be token decks like Black and White that mostly their synergy is trying to buff everything up. Buff up your tokens and such. So Heroic Reinforcements, I'm going to say, other than the one guy that wants to make the Boros Go Wide deck just because they want to have fun, it's jank. I don't think it's going to see Standard play that much. Now, for modern and internal formats like Legacy and Vintage, I'm actually going to go out and say maybe. And the reason why I'm going to say maybe on this is that there is enough aggro-based Boros decks that might, if they need a budget option, they might actually consider this card. The fact that it creates the tokens, the fact that it gives your creatures haste, and that little +1/+1 boost might actually go out and just help be a finisher in some Goblin-style decks. It's definitely a maybe. I'm not sure if people would absolutely play it, but still, at least in Modern, I think it might see play. Now, Legacy and Vintage, no. There's a lot better Trumpet Blast options in those formats. So, and there's a lot better options to give creatures haste in those formats. So, I would say no. So, other than Modern and some Draft and Commander/Brawl play, it'll be interesting to see how this card evolves and see how much people want to use this card. Anyway, on to the next card, which is, I think, our second to last to be the last signpost card before we get to the Elder Dragons, which is Skywriter Patrol. It's a 2-mana Simic colors, which is green and blue, so it's a 4-mana 2/3 flyer, creature Elf Scout, and it has flying, and it's at the beginning of combat on your turn, you may pay green and a blue. When you do, put a 1/1 counter on another target creature you control, and that creature gains flying until end of turn. So, obviously in this one, they're trying to encourage, kind of like how you saw it in some other color signposts, they're more encouraging kind of an evasive mid-range deck. Your main point is to buff up your creatures and try to either make them invasive, or try to make them big enough that they can go in for lethal damage. So does this card encourage that in Draft and Sealed? I would say yes. This is a relatively decent bomb in that archetype. The fact that you get a 2/3 flyer is alright for 4 mana. I mean, it's not like the biggest flyer you can get, don't get me wrong. But the ability of the fact that on combat on your turn, you don't have to attack with this, mind you. But you can just spend green and a blue and put it on something that is really big and can be bomby. Like you can put this on a 6/6 trampler to make it a 7/7 trample flyer. That ability is nothing to sneeze at. So I think in Draft and Limited, this is going to be a bomb. You probably want to pick up this card and then go into green-blue mid-range and just have the time of your life. Now, in Commander and Brawl, I say this is playable as well. It's just that ability for blue and a green to just give your creature flying and put a counter on it. There's so many decks that benefit on counters type synergies and making your creatures evasive in these colors that I think it will see play in Commander and Brawl. No sweat. Standard, I'm going to go out on a limb and say that it might see play as a card in Merfolk. weirdly enough. The factor is that in Merfolk decks, they're trying to build up their Merfolk to try to make them go big and be evasive to attack in. And this card, even though it's an elf, does actually help benefit with the evasiveness. It helps make their creatures evasive enough so they can take their biggest Merfolk, or even if they splash blue in dinosaurs, make a big dinosaur go in for evasive damage. Seriously, that mana sink ability is really good. The only thing that might not make this slightly standard playable and put it into the maybe is that, well, removal is a thing in this format, and if people kill this off right when you play it, it does kind of feel bad. Now, in Eternal formats like Modern, Legacy, and Vintage, I'm gonna go and say either maybe to jank. It's just one of those where a 2-mana 2-fleet flyer can die to a lot of removal in that format before you can even take advantage of the combat ability. So I'm going to go out and say it's either going to be maybe to just jank. However, I really do adore the design of this card. I think this is a card that's going to be helping mid-range decks in multiple formats out a lot. Because really the hardest thing for some decks is to get the damage in and be evasive enough. And this card just does that without a sweat, which is great. Now I think we had to get on to one of the highlight cards of this set that are in gold, which are the Elder Dragons. Now for those of you who don't know, the Elder Dragons are actually an original set of cards that came from one of the older Magic sets. I'm forgetting it right off the bat. But they're essentially these very highly powerful cards. And what they're doing now is they're actually redesigning all these Elder Dragons for this set. And just some of them are actually really cool. Like this one. Arcades the Strategist. A 4-mana, 1-mana generic, banned colors, green, white, blue, legendary creature, Elder Dragon, mythic. It has flying and vigilance, is a 3/5, and whenever a creature with Defender enters the battlefield under your control, draw a card. Each creature you control with Defender assigns combat damage equal to its toughness rather than its power, and can attack as though it didn't have Defender. Okay, let's actually get into Limited and Sealed first. I think people will still play this for fun, but be very, very careful. Just play this card because it's a 4-mana free 5 flying vigilance. Don't try to go crazy with this in Sealed and try to put all the Defender cards in there, unless you are a relatively slow-paced deck. But even then, I would be very cautious. There is some Defender in the set, but I don't think it's enough that if you pack one, pick one this, that you go straight into Defender deck. Try to just keep either a green-white or even a green-blue mid-range deck, and this card is just decent enough in those decks as is. So, in Limited, I would say it's playable to maybe. Now, in Commander and Brawl, oh, this is going to be playable. Oh man, people have been trying to, in Commander, think of so many Defender wall decks that use other commanders, and this Commander is perfect for Defender decks. The fact that you cycle when you play your Defender cards, the fact that it gives you the enchantment to help you attack with the toughness, which Defenders are usually known for very big butts, very high toughness. So this is a go-to, this is going to be the go-to Defender Commander for a while. And I think in Brawl, if there's enough Defenders in Standard, which I think there is, I need to actually check all of Standard again to see how many Defenders there are. I think there's still enough to actually just have fun with this and just try it out. But in Commander, this is going to see play. No sweat about that. People are going to make their Defender decks, and they're going to have a blast. Now, in Modern and Eternal formats like Modern, Legacy, and Vintage, you know, this might actually see Modern play. As many people who actually are kind of tilting their head sideways as I was when I saw it, the professor from Tulare Community College actually said that this potentially can be a Modern playable card. And I first laughed at the idea, but the more I think about it, the more I think it's actually possible. There's actually a variety of low-cost walls that people do play in the format, no sweat about it. Wall of Omens, Wall of Roots. I can keep going. And also, there's just some very powerful free cost walls that have Shroud and such. And the fact that Coco, Collected Company decks, and even Genesis Wave style decks are popular, I think a modern version of this deck is very possible. But I'm still going to put it at maybe to either janky, because if I do go back into modern, I might actually make this into my modern deck, because that's actually kind of hilarious. As for the Eternal formats like Legacy and Vintage, I'm going to go and say maybe. I don't play the format far enough that I don't know if people will play a Defender-style deck just because of this card in those formats. So for those who play this format, help comment and just tell me if this is playable in those formats. I'm kind of leaning on maybe, but I could also see this being no depending on certain outlooks and such. Anyway, onto the next Elder Dragon, which is, it's a good one. Chromium the Mutable. It's a 7-mana dragon, which is 4 generic, white, blue, and black. It's a 7/7 legendary creature Elder Dragon that has Flash, which for those who are new to the game means you can cast this at any time you can cast an instant spell, meaning also on your opponent's turn. This spell can't be countered. Oh. It also has flying. Oh. Oh, and has an activate ability to discard a card, and until in a turn, Chromium the Mutable becomes a human with base power toughness 1/1, loses all abilities, and gains hexproof. It can't be blocked this turn. Whew. In limited, guys, this is a bomb. If you are in those color archetypes, if you're either in blue-black or you're in blue-white and you can splash for this, play this card. You're going to have a blast. The fact that you can flash it in, and it's a 7/7 flyer that is very evasive, it's very hard to remove, it's going to see play in limited. There are going to be games that you play this and you're going to have fun, but if you play against this, some of you are probably not going to have a fun time playing against this card. I'm just going to say that right off the bat. Now, in formats like Brawl and Standard, yeah, it's playable as well. In Brawl specifically, because for many people, they prefer the Esper colors. And currently at the moment, there's not really any Esper color commanders. Well, Chromium now provides that option. So if you want to play Esper Brawl, hey, Chromium will help you do that. And in Commander, yeah, I'll probably see playing Commander, no sweat. Dragon decks are looking at this and they're thinking, oh hey, a 7/7 that can't be countered. Nice. And I'm even thinking about potential jank play with this and putting it like in a jokingly human tribal deck to take advantage of the discard card ability. But keep in mind, mostly the discard ability is just used for evasion. Which is the reason why I think it might also be standard playable. This is a late game bomb for many control style decks. Now, the catch-22 is, I think this is going to be a better bomb post-rotation rather than the current standard meta. And the main reason for that is there's a lot of cards that are controlling in the current meta that are very specifically, you don't have to target the opponent to remove a creature, aka Doomfall. And trying to ramp up to this bomb and then have it get removed by Doomfall will feel kind of bad. But once rotation happens, this will see play. I mean, unless they provide any other cards that are sacrificial in the sense like Doomfall is, this is just a really good late game bomb. I mean, it's amazing. Now, in Eternal formats like Modern, Legacy, and Vintage, I'm going to say no. While this card is amazing, 7 mana is a lot. And those formats are relatively fast-paced enough that trying to play a 7-mana 7/7 is tricky. Like, there are ramp decks in the format, but you have to be green. There's not really any white, blue, black ramp-style decks. Now, there are cards to get legendary creatures out for cheap and such, and you can probably name a few right off the bat. But I think you want to keep this consistently on the battlefield rather than have it for a turn or such. So in Eternal formats like Modern, Legacy, and Vintage, I'm going to say no. Still, this card is amazing, and boy, I want to see the foil on this, because I think the foil would be amazing. Okay, and now on to the bomb of the set, the major highlight card of the set. Nicol Bolas the Ravager. This is a 4-mana 4/4 flyer legendary creature Elder Dragon. It is 1 generic, blue, red, and black, so Grits' colors. And it has the ability that when it enters the battlefield, each opponent discards a card. It also has an activated ability of 7 mana, 4 generic, Grits' colors, that says, exile Nicol Bolas the Ravager, and return him to the battlefield, transform under his owner's control. Activate this ability only any time you can cast a sorcery. Now, before we get to the Planeswalker part of this card, which is really powerful, I just need to go out and say it. A 4-mana 4/4 flyer that makes an opponent discard a card on turn 4 is really good. I mean, this just side itself is amazing. And the fact that there are in multiple formats ways to flicker this card and make it where the opponent constantly have to discard the card, this card is amazing. I mean, the art's amazing. And the Planeswalker side, too, is just bonkers. So, he transforms into, or flips to, Nicol Bolas the Arisen. A legendary Planeswalker Bolas that has 7 loyalty. That's absurd. That has +2, draw 2 cards. -3, Nicol Bolas the Arisen deals 10 damage to target creature or Planeswalker. -4, put target creature or Planeswalker card from a graveyard onto the battlefield under your control. That's including your opponent's graveyard. Oh, and -12, which does just something measly like exile all except the bottom card of target player's library. Excuse me there. So, Nicol Bolas the Ravager and Nicol Bolas the Arisen, both as 1 card. It's a bomb. In Draft and Sealed, you want to play this card. I would say don't go too crazy if your poll does not support the Grits' colors or a variation of the colors. As tempting as this bomb is, don't try to play it. It's still playable though if you are in those colors, and it's an amazing bomb. One thing I would say, while the Planeswalker side is tempting, just take advantage of the fact that it's going to be a 4-mana 4/4 flyer. Because the thing is, even if you try to activate the ability, you can only activate it at sorcery speed. So, you do have to keep in mind that when you activate it, that people can remove it on the stack. But still, just a 4-mana 4/4 flyer that makes an opponent discards a card, it's just a good card. So in Draft and Limited and Sealed, this is playable. In Commander and Brawl, are people going to play this card? Yeah, they are going to play this card. There's some Grits style decks that might just put this card in just because the overall value you can generate from both sides of the card. And even, we have enough Nicol Bolas cards currently before the rotation that I think there's some people that's just going to make a Nicol Bolas themed Brawl deck, and it's just going to be fun to see people play with that. Will it see play in Standard? I'm going to say maybe to playable. I think it's maybe within the current meta, because the factor that we have a lot of Amaket style /also//Karadesh block cards that kind of easily remove this card without a sweat. So I think it's going to be maybe, but once rotation happens, will this see play? I think it's a redundant yes, because they're the type of mid-range decks that do like to take advantage of the discard card synergy. It's going to be hard to flip this, so I think most people are just going to take advantage of the fact that it's a 4-mana 4/4 flyer, which is good. However, if you can flip it in Standard, you pretty much win the game. There are some there are going to be circumstances where people will remove this using Vraska's Contempt, so keep that in mind. But if you can at least get off with one of the activated abilities, that's going to give you significant board state advantage, and I think it will see play just because of that post-rotation. Now, in Eternal formats like Modern, Legacy, and Vintage, Modern is a maybe. Grits' control style decks actually would not mind this as just a 4-mana 4/4 flyer that makes an opponent discard a card. But also, it's just the Planeswalker side is too slow. But I think still people will like the fact that if they can flicker the 4/4 flyer and make opponents essentially discard the hand pretty quick, I think it has a potential to either see maybe too janky play in Modern. Legacy and Vintage, as tempting as this is, I don't know. This is a legitimate maybe on this one. There's a part of me that wants to go with my gut instinct and say that this is possibly too slow for those formats. But like I said, I don't play the format much enough that I can't tell. But this card is legitimately powerful. Yep, you're going to have some fun playing this card if you have a chance to get your hands on it. So, have fun with it. You probably got the value card of the set, if we're being quite frankly honest. Anyway, on to the next card, and I think it's the second to last Elder Dragon of this set, which is, and forgive me if my pronunciation here, the Victus Asmodi the Dire. It is a 6-mana 6/6 flying legendary creature Elder Dragon. It's 3 mana, red, green, black, so Jund colors. That's a 6/6 flyer. This is a Tet Spot. This is going to be a Tet Spot, so give me a breathe. Whenever this creature attacks, for each player, choose target permanent that player controls. Note that this is going to affect every player, including yourself. That player sacrifices those permanents. Each player who sacrifices a permanent this way reveals the top card of their library, then puts it onto the battlefield if it's a permanent card. So, what this card essentially does is whenever it attacks, it Chaos Warps. You pretty much choose a permanent that player controls, including one of your own permanents. You sack the permanent, and then you reveal your top card of your library, and if it's a permanent, it goes straight onto the battlefield. In Drafted and Limited, I think this is a playable card. ... if you're into the ramp deck. I would say be very cautious of playing this deck if you're not ramping, because 6 mana, 6/6 flyer, while tempting, it's kinda hard to ramp to. I think this is going to be a lot more playable and sealed though, even if you're not in the ramp deck, because as long as you're in a black-green mid-range or even a red-green ramp, this is a playable card just to splash for if you can splash for it. And just that ability itself, while not game-breaking per se, it's just a fun ability. And if you can brew your deck around the fact to take advantage of the Chaos Warp style ability, this is just really fun. Now, in formats like Commander and Brawl, yeah, this is going to see play. There are just people who are either really tempted to put this in their Dragon decks, or they just want to make a deck revolving around this as their commander. Because being able to attack and Chaos Warp each turn, every player, and just have the chaos of what will happen, it's just amazing. It'll be fun to see people play this first time as their commanders and just see the overall chaos that this card provides. Now, in Standard, I'm going to go on a limb and say maybe. And the reason why is because mostly ramp-style decks are either in the mono-green variety. Ramp decks are not really in the multicolor variety at the moment. And while this is a nice, quote-unquote, big bomb to get out, the factor is it needs to attack. And the factor that it doesn't have hexproof, it is prone to a lot of removal. You're kind of forecasting when you play this card, and in some control archetypes, they're just going to remove this as soon as you play it. But I will say maybe, though, because if you're in a proper ramp deck that can actually get this out and protect it, this is kind of a funny card to play. The reason, though, I'm still going to stick to maybe is even if you attack with it, there's enough decks in the format that still will have permanents that are playable that they can get from this Chaos Warp style ability. Though it will be hilarious to play this against a control deck that don't have any permanents and then they accidentally waste their permanents. But on the other side of the coin, there's also enough control decks that use control-based aura enchantments that they can just get an enchantment aura and actually remove this from the Chaos Warp ability. So, I'm going to say maybe. And then in formats like Modern, Legacy, Vintage, I'm just going to go out on a limb and say it'll probably be no, or it's going to be janky. because I don't think people... 6 mana is a heavy cost in that format. You don't see cards at that cost played in those type of formats, with some rare exceptions. And while it is tempting, I am still going to say out of limb and say no. No. However, though, it is going to be a fun card to play, and I think I can't wait to make this as my commander. I mean, the chaos that you can produce with this is going to be amazing. Anyway, that is the gold set review, I believe, of the cards. Oh wait, there is one more Elder Dragon. I forgot about this one. So, this one is actually Nicol Bolas' sister, and it's Palladia Mors the Ruiner. It is a 6 mana, free generic, red, green, white, legendary creature Elder Dragon. It's a 6/6 flyer that has flying, vigilance, trample. And it has a semi-hexproof ability, which says, has hexproof if it hasn't dealt damage yet. So, is this a bomb and limited and sealed? Yeah, I'll say it so. The fact that it's just a 6 mana flying vigilance and trample, that's just a really good bomb in itself. People will have to try to remove this as soon as they can. And the fact that it has semi-hexproof, as long as you don't deal damage, you are going to get at least a decent chunk of damage in before they remove this. But the semi-hexproof, it's both kind of a benefit and a cost in other formats. I say in Commander and in Brawl, if you need a Naiad Commander for Brawl, there are worser options, I would say. There are better options too, but I think this option will be fun to toy with at the very least. Especially when you can give it Double Strike or something, or maybe make it into a Voltron-style commander deck where you try to make this as powerful before it can do its lethal damage. But still, one thing to keep in mind is that the version that's going to lose hexproof when it deals damage is the version that's on the battlefield. So you could, in theory, and I think this is the thing that's going to make it potentially standard playable, if you can make a Flicker-style deck in standard that takes advantage of the factor that new copies of this, when it flicks back in, will still gain its hexproof, I think this might actually be a decent late-game bomb for standard. So I think as long as those colors are supported, which we have a lot of color fixing currently in the format, so I think it might be supported, I say this is a playable card in standard. Yeah, I know, kind of shocking. I think you're going to see this card a lot in standard, so just be careful. Now, internal formats like Modern, Legacy, and Vintage, I'm going to say janky play in Modern, but no in Vintage and Legacy. It's too high cost, and the factor that it just only has semi-hexproof just kind of makes it You'll play it if you need to, but I don't think people will play this card in those formats. However, I do think it's kind of a very fun card to actually try to break in standard, and I do think it's going to be a fun commander and draft card. Anyway, that's all the gold cards currently in this set. I'm going to try to get onto the other colors nets and just get them all done before the pre-release. I hope you enjoyed this review series, and you have a good day now.